You may later, I don't know, but let me ask Mr. Mack, does the defendant have another word?
We do, Your Honor. This time we're going to call Dr. Douglas Johnson.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear you testify the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Please watch all that equipment and that stair there. Have a seat there and kindly speak to me. You also watch your knees. And you will see that chair doesn't move. It's 40-something years old. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Dr. Johnson, please state your name, spell your last name for the record.
Douglas Christian Johnson. Last name is spelled Johnsson.
Okay. And what do you do for a living, sir?
I am a clinical neuropsychologist. My primary employer is Naval Special Warfare in San Diego, California.
Okay. Do you also work at other places or for other entities?
I do. I have a faculty appointment at the University of California, San Diego in the Department of Psychiatry. I'm an assistant professor. It's a non-salaried appointment. And I also conduct private forensic work.
Okay. And if you could, for the court, briefly describe the subject matter of your area of expertise.
My subject matter area of expertise is primarily the interaction of brain and behavior relationships under high stress. And that ranges on a continuum from what we call pathology, so individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury, to the other end of the spectrum, and that's individuals who do really well in high stress situations, evaluating them, selecting them, assessing them, and using interventions to help them perform better under stress.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about your education. How did you arrive? Any specialized training, education?
Yes, my PhD was earned at UCLA in clinical and cognitive psychology. I completed 2 years of postdoctoral training at Yale University School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry.
Okay. You've also done work for the U.S. intelligence community, is that correct?
That's correct. I was a counterterrorism and counterintelligence analyst, psychologist. I was involved in profiling and target assessment.
Okay. Can you give us a little bit more detail about that?
I will give you as much detail as I can. It involves looking at individuals, largely what we call indirect assessment. So that is an evaluation of an individual without actually sitting across a table doing a formal traditional evaluation. So a lot of this was done either without the individual knowing, or from a distance, or from available evidence.
So under those circumstances, you have the ability to learn about an individual without direct contact. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. You have also worked for the United States Navy. Is that correct?
That's correct. I've worked for the Navy for approximately 9 years now. In a variety of capacities. I've been a department head for a research arm of the Navy, their operational stress control program. I ran a research lab called Warfighter Performance, where we were dedicated primarily to looking at the warfighter's function from the neck up. The focus of our program of research was special operations individuals in close quarters combat. And so we would deploy with them, we would go out into the field with them, we would make field observations and combine that with laboratory-based studies that included brain imaging, assessment of biomarkers, looking at physiology, all in both field and laboratory settings.
You mentioned close quarters combat. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what's unique about that?
Within the special operations community, close quarters combat, we'll call it CQC or close quarters battle, CQB, it's a foundational skill set for all special operations forces. They're often asked to go into tight, confined spaces, often under compressed time, often under situations where identification of a threat is very difficult and they have to make decisions under a compressed time period and under certainly high-stress conditions.
Okay. You've also presented to senior leadership at the Pentagon, is that correct?
That's correct. I've presented within the Pentagon that it's noted as the E-ring. Inside the E-ring, I've presented to leadership. I presented to the Defense Science Board, the Intelligence Science Board, Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps, in addition to a variety of intelligence agencies.
Okay. How long have you been in private forensic practice now?
I began my forensic work in 2006, so roughly 9 years.
9 years, okay. And in your area of expertise, do you have any publications?
I have over 30 publications, peer-reviewed publications. I have a couple of book chapters that I've authored or co-authored. I am often asked to serve as a reviewer for journals that invite me to review, meaning when other scholars submit their scientific research, I'm asked to review it for its merit, for its reliability and validity, and then offer an opinion on whether it's publishable or not.
Okay. And you are licensed in your field of practice, is that correct?
That's correct. I'm licensed by the Board of Psychology in the state of California.
All right. Any other teaching or lecturing in your area of expertise?
I do some clinical supervision, meaning I assist other either graduate students or medical residents with patients that they have. I also do a fair amount of instructing to non-clinicians, by meaning I work at Naval Special Warfare. Much of the training is done by instructors, special operators, and I provide training on the brain and behavior under stress. I also provide training to special operations forces on mental skills that help individuals do well under stress.
Okay. And as a clinical psychologist in your private forensic practice, have you provided expert opinion in cases involving high-impact stress, decision-making, attention, concentration, disassociation, memory, traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes, I've offered an opinion on a variety of cases. I've testified roughly 8 to 10 times, and those have been done in state and federal court as well as military court.
So you have been admitted as an expert in your field of practice?
Yes.
Okay. And how many times would you approximate that you have testified?
I believe I've testified 8 times.
Okay. And that involves state court, federal court, what?
All of those.
Okay. Military tribunals?
Yes.
Okay. And when you've testified, have you testified just for one side, for example, the defense or the prosecutor, or have you, how's that going?
No, it's right at about 50-50.
Okay. For this case, you're getting paid, is that correct?
Yes.
And how much money do you believe you're getting paid?
I believe I have invoiced for $5,600.
Okay. Can you please tell Judge Lodano how it is that you became involved in this case?
I became involved in this case through contact with Attorney D'Angelo, as well as a colleague, Dr. Ron Martinelli. Ron and I have worked together for a few years, and when he receives information on cases that he thinks I can inform from a brain behavior perspective, he asked for my opinion. I talked to Attorney D'Angelo and said this is the case that I can inform.
All right. You were asked to provide an expert opinion on cognitive function under stress, and also Officer Michael Brelo's mental state at the time of the alleged offense in this case. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did you generate a report?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And did that report have findings and conclusions in it?
Yes, it did.
Okay. Your Honor, may I approach?
Sure.
I have reviewed this with the state already. I'm handing to you what's been marked as Defendant's Exhibit CCC. Can you take a look at that and identify it for the record?
Yes, this is the report of evaluation that I submitted to Attorney D'Angelo's office on this case.
Okay. And did you provide opinions in this case?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And the opinions that you provided Were those opinions made with a reasonable degree of medical and scientific certainty?
Yes, they were.
Okay. And did you provide a summary of the opinions early on in your report?
Yes.
And can you please indicate what those opinions are?
So I provided 3 opinions, and those were in chronological order of the events that took place. One was an opinion on the situational and psychological context that Officer Brelo was operating under. The second opinion was regarding his mental state at the time of the alleged offense. And thirdly, I offered an opinion regarding the subsequent inability to recall certain aspects of the events in question.
Okay. And can you please indicate to the court the evidence that you reviewed in order to arrive at your conclusions in this case?
It was a large amount of evidence, including transcripts, videos of interviews, photos. The evidence that I interviewed is listed on page 4 of my report, and that would include all the items 1 through 20.
Okay. And just for the record, can you identify, you can read those, can you identify some?
Sure. Number 1 is court document, criminal complaint, Cuyahoga County. Number 2 is the computer-aided dispatch transcripts. Number 3 are the scene photographs. Number 4 are the scene diagrams. Number 5, the shooting incident reconstruction and scan report photographs. Number 6, vehicle trajectory determination reports. Number 7, transcribed witness statements from officers and witnesses. Number 8, transcribed officer statements, both shooting officers and non-shooting officers. Number 9, video of the interview of Officer Michael Brelo. Number 10, video of the interview of Officer Cynthia Moore.
Okay. Doctor, I'm sorry. And you went on to review medical examiner reports as well, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And follow-up interview statements by Sergeant Flanagan, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you also reviewed the expert report of Ron Martinelli, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. On page 5 of 13, you began your first opinion, is that correct?
Yes.
And under the extended opinions, you identified the situational and psychological context Officer Michael Brelo was operating under while on duty immediately prior to the officer-involved shooting. Why is that important?
Anytime we're evaluating behavior of an individual, particularly behavior of an individual under stress, to really understand what was going on inside an individual's mind, it's important to understand what situational factors were occurring and what that individual was perceiving with all senses, what they were hearing, what they were seeing, what they were experiencing, things that they said, in order to get a better idea of what was going through that person's mind.
Okay. And further, court, you described what is priming?
Priming is a construct from cognitive psychology, and what it means is the brain is preparing to process information. And so when the brain's primed, it more readily assesses, attends to, and processes information. In a simple, innocuous laboratory example, if an individual is in a sad or depressed state, and you show them pictures of sad words, depressing photos, they are going to identify those words and pictures at a significantly faster rate and be more accurate at identifying those than an individual who's not been primed. Conversely, they're also going to have a harder time diverting attention from those. So if you put up a picture of a sad word and a non-sad word, they're going to be quicker to recognize the sad word, and they're also going to have a harder time diverting their attention away from the sad word. So priming is a cognitive phenomenon where the brain is ready and will more rapidly receive information about the thing that they're primed for.
Okay. And what is potentiation?
So potentiation is a neuroscience phenomenon, and that has to do with optimal or receiving full response to a situation. So within the realm of brain research on the fear response, we have something called fear potentiation. In the everyday world, the best example of something like this comes from Hollywood. Hollywood are masters at fear potentiation. They will get an audience and they will create a movie to potentiate the fear response. So that means to make the fear response stronger and more robust than it would be if it were not potentiated. The way they do this, they both prime the individuals watching. You're listening, you're hearing music, there's tension that's mounting through what's presented, what's hidden, what's not hidden, the sounds of things, and there's a slow draw up, and then there's a response. What we know from laboratory-based experiments is when the fear is potentiated, the fear response is stronger than if the fear were just presented immediately.
Okay. Talk about perceived stressfulness of an event. What factors influence that? So,
from what we know about how individuals respond to stress, early on, when research was being done on the human stress response or the mammalian stress response, there was a model, and that was when you have a stimulus that's stressful, you get a response. And that's true by and large for a lot of things. But what we started to learn was that the same stimulus does not always produce the same response. And there was an effort to determine what differentiated, why can you show some individuals the same response, the same stimulus, and you get different responses? Well, that's because the missing piece in this stimulus response model, the missing piece is the organism. And there are individual differences in how those stimuli are perceived. Some of the seminal work done by, say, Richard Lazarus and Susan Folkman in Berkeley back in the 70s, they found that one of the strongest indicators that influenced the response was how the organism or how the individual perceived the stressor. So classic experiment was to show a group of 50 to 100 individuals a mass triage, just a real blood and guts scenario, and they looked at how stressful those individuals responded to that situation.
Okay.
Then they took another group of people, they showed them the same scenario, but this time they did something a little different. They took those individuals and they said, for about 10 or 15 minutes, we want you to put yourself in the mindset of an ER doctor. So those individuals thought about being an ER doctor and having to respond to a scene. They walked in, then they were presented with the same triage pictures that the former group did, and their stress responses were a lot lower.
Okay.
So that's an example. What we know about stress and its perception, three things. And these three things are critical to what I do on a daily basis because it's where we leverage our training program for Special Operations Forces. Stressful events are heightened when they're perceived as novel, meaning it's something that the individual has never experienced before. When they're perceived as uncontrollable, meaning the individual doesn't think that their coping mechanisms are sufficient or their responses are doing enough to mitigate the stress. And stressors are heightened when the stress is unpredictable, meaning this is not going according to plan and I didn't think this was going to happen.
Okay. You reviewed this case, including Michael Brelo's interview, is that correct?
Yes.
And you received information from several officer interviews and all the other information that you went through, is that correct?
Correct.
Tie the variables that you just discussed into what you believe Michael Brelo experienced that night of November 29th, 2012.
So from my review of the evidence and based on what I know about how individuals respond in tactical situations, this was an instance of a protracted 15 to 20 minute car chase where there were multiple sources of information saying that there were shots fired. There was an indication of a weapon being presented. So through the course of that 15 to 20 minute preparation, there was sufficient opportunity for priming and definitely for potentiation. And in terms of novelty, based on what I have read and understand from Officer Brelo's experience, as well as his statements his fellow officer statements. This is not something that he was familiar with. I mean, he was even operating, it sounded like, in areas that he was not as familiar with. So there was an element of novelty to this, not something that police officers train for on an everyday basis. Certainly something they should be more prepared for than the average citizen, but relative to their day-to-day operations, a novel event. High stress, high degree of threat. The individuals were not responding. They were not listening to officer commands. They were not stopping, and there was plenty of time to put him in a mindset of, all right, this is a high-stress environment. This is dangerous.
Okay. In paragraph 1.4 of your report, on page 6 of 13, you discuss terms of sudden passion, rage. Were you describing those terms in a legal context or some other context?
No, definitely not a legal context. So when I hear something, a sudden passion or rage, what we're talking about in psychological terms is acute versus chronic. Is this an instance of an individual having an acute emotional reaction or acute emotional reactivity, or is this something that's a bit more drawn out? And so when I'm talking about evaluating whether this is a sudden bout of passion or rage, that's more, a sudden rage is more consistent with, that's where the term road rage comes from. That is somebody get cut off on the freeway, and some physical or violent altercation occurs. It happens in a very compressed time frame. A 15 to 20 minute high-speed pursuit with the potential for a weapon and shots being fired is not something that I would consider acute or sudden. That's more drawn out.
Okay. Now, relative to Officer Brelo, you wrote some opinion in paragraph 1.4. Go ahead and expound on that.
So, I'm just going to read from my opinion here. This event is extended over a 20-minute high-speed vehicle pursuit and ended in a 45-second shootout. Combat and law enforcement shootouts are known to engender a dissociative effect of time dilation. Attention is hyper-focused, cognitive and physiological resources are allocated and redirected to respond to a stressor. Events happening in millisecond resolution are perceived to occur over minutes and hours. High-speed pursuit followed by an extended duration, close-quarter shootout comprising over 139 rounds fired are not provocations that suggest sudden passion or rage.
Okay. Now, there are a couple of concepts in that paragraph that, as lay people, we're not familiar with. Can you talk to us about time dilation and what your experiences have been with that?
No, it is an interesting phenomenon, and oddly enough, most people can have some experience with this. It doesn't have to be a high-stress situation. A high-stress situation makes it more likely to happen, and it's going to happen with greater intensity, but we've all had periods of some relative degree of stress, and time seems to be moving more slowly than it really is.
Based on your review of the information in this case, did you see evidence of that with multiple police officers involved in this case?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And to the best of your recollection, can you identify what observation you're talking about?
In particular, if I'm going to look through my report here, I believe
Take your time.
So opinion 3.3, page 11. I'll just read from this because there are, I think, 4 other officers other than Officer Brelo who made statements that are consistent with what we consider an altered reality. In fact, publications by some of my colleagues on high-speed, high-functioning individuals refer to this as the fog of war. And that is when you feel like you're in a cognitive fog. So the statements that were made. Officer Paul Bach said,
Objection, Your Honor.
Based on what?
He's going through a number of statements of other officers that are not in evidence and that are hearsay.
Yeah, but they're not coming in as substantive evidence. They're coming in as materials he reviewed to form his opinions. Indeed, when any expert forms a pretrial opinion, it's not known what the evidence will be at trial. You are certainly welcome to cross-examine him on what the evidence really has been here, and you're certainly welcome in argument to comment that some of his opinions took into account things that ultimately weren't in evidence. But I think the objection is not well taken, so it's overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You may continue, Dr. Johnson.
so I'll begin with Officer Paul Bach said, quote, "This is where things get foggy for me." That's an indication of his ability to perceive events going on around him are not clear. So there's a mental fog. Bach said it felt, quote, "really strange," and that he could not explain time. Officer Bach characterized it as, quote, "being in another dimension," unquote. He said he felt pulled in multiple directions simultaneously. Officer Scott Seistek, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, did not recall pulling his partner to the ground to take cover. Officer Patricia Coleman stated that her observation of the scene appeared, quote, "eerie" to her. She described, quote, "a dense fog in the air with lights reflecting off the fog," unquote. She was disoriented and at one point took cover and lost visual contact with the suspects. She asked her partner, quote, "Can you see where they are? Are they coming for us?" She further said she thought they were going to be killed by the suspects and that she thought the officers in car number 217, Brelo and Moore's car, were dead. Officer Michael Farley said it was, quote, "the scariest thing in my life," unquote, and exited the car without putting on his vest.
You've also seen this in the arena of military combat as well, is that correct?
I have. It is really the focal point of my mental skills training program with Special Operations Forces to try and reduce this as much as possible. Given the degree of individual differences in the nature of high-stress life and death situations, I think that it is impossible to prevent. The brain is going to respond as the brain sees fit to preserve life, but we try and mitigate these responses.
Okay. You also mentioned in that paragraph psychophysiological resources are allocated and redirected to respond to a stressor. Can you identify that? So
this is a really important concept. It's something most people can relate to because in a very low-level way, we've all experienced this. Imagine yourself on the way to the dry cleaner, and you've got to pick up your dry cleaning, and that's where you're headed, and then an ambulance passes you, maybe a fire truck going the other direction. All of a sudden, maybe you get a little arousal, there's a little spike in stress, and the next thing you know, you've gotten to work or wherever you're going to go, and you completely forgot about what you were going to go do. There's a reason for that. There's a neurological and neuropsychological reason for that. Under stress, I'm going to oversimplify how the brain is structured. We have a prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of our brain. That's our strategizing, that is our planning, that is our decision-making region. It's responsible for a lot, but that functions best under situations where we're not in fight or flight. When we're in fight or flight, the brain will say, that's an expensive function, it's an expensive system to run, we're going to redirect metabolic resources, we're going to redirect energy resources to preservation. So that happens in the brain. Activity decreases in the prefrontal cortex, and activity in the limbic system increases. In particular, the systems that are responsible for how we experience emotion, how we process information. Blood and energy is also redirected in our extremities. So we get something that's called vasoconstriction. Anybody who's ever done any degree of shooting under stress or any athletic performance under stress has experienced this maybe a little hand tremor, maybe feeling a little shaky, a little lightheaded. That's all part of a normal stress response. In situations of high stress, life-threatening conditions, those experiences are magnified. The body is trying to preserve life, so it redirects blood flow to major muscle groups. In the off event that an individual will get a laceration or take an injury to an extremity, you hear corpsmen talk about seeing this phenomenon all the time on the battlefield. They will take a casualty who's been hit in the leg or the arm, and they'll see where the wound is. They'll see the wound, but there's not a whole lot of blood flow from it. And that's because it's either been cauterized or the individual is experiencing vasoconstriction. And about 5 to 10 minutes into the helicopter ride, all of a sudden there's a pool of blood that seemingly came from nowhere. And that's because once the body has relaxed, vasoconstriction is no longer there. They get vasodilation. That wound opens up and blood flow is restored.
Dr. Johnson, I'd like to take you to paragraph 1.5 of your report. You touched on this a little bit already, but what is fear-potentiated startle?
So fear-potentiated startle is a modification of our normal startle response. So similar to the example that I gave in a movie theater in an innocuous situation. Fear-potentiated startle is a startle response that's stronger. It is a fear response that's stronger than normal because there has been priming and potentiation that takes place prior to that.
Okay. And relative to what occurred in this case, tell us regarding what you believe Officer Brelo experienced as it relates to that concept of fear-potentiated startle.
The conditions in this situation are consistent with having the most extreme stress response. You had a protracted 15 to 20 minutes of preparation for a life-threatening event. And then you had perception of a stressful event that was novel, unpredictable, and seemingly uncontrollable, and where I think both subjectively and objectively there was a threat of life involved in this situation.
Okay. I think you've indicated that each opinion that you've given was made with a reasonable degree of medical and scientific certainty. What was your first opinion, the extensive version of it?
So, opinion one was, throughout a protracted high-speed pursuit, multiple indicators were there to prepare for a high-stress encounter. Officer Brelo's attention and concentration were primed to rapidly identify environmental cues as threatening. In response to the quality, quantity, and frequency of these cues, Officer Brelo's fear and psychophysiological activation were potentiated. In other words, they were magnified well before making any use of force decisions. Extended arousal of the autonomic nervous system for 15 to 20 minutes during the pursuit and continuing through the 45-second shootout contraindicates a sudden passion or rage. Indicators of a life-threatening encounter were reasonable, credible, and corroborated by multiple sources. Sensory indicators of a life-threatening encounter included sights, sounds, and touch. Multiple sensory modalities served to intensify Officer Brelo's fear. Investigative evidence suggests there was a real and observable threat to his life and the life of his partner. Perceptions of threat were primed. Fear and anxiety were potentiated. In the moments preceding his pursuit and encounter with suspects on a high-speed chase, Officer Brelo received sensory information preparing him for a life-threatening encounter. The threat information Officer Brelo received included sights, sounds, and touch. He heard officers report shots fired. He heard several times that one of the passengers pointed a gun at officers. He heard from Sergeant Coleman that one of the vehicle occupants was loading a gun. He observed the suspect car driving recklessly, failing to stop, and attempting to evade police. He observed the suspect car collide into police cars. He observed the passenger and driver point a dark object at his car. He felt as if bullets were coming at him. This fear persisted and even intensified. Evidence suggests that there was a real and observable threat to his life and the life of his partner. His fears were reasonable and potentiated by several factors outside of his control. His behavior in the minutes preceding the officer-involved shootings on November 29, 2014 are consistent with feelings of potentiated fear and ultimately the presentation of an imminent threat.
Moving on to opinion number 2. You discuss Officer Brelo's mental state at the time of officer-involved shootings on the evening of November 29th of 2012. In paragraph 2.2, page 7 of 13, you explain that individuals in anxious or fearful states demonstrate alteration of several cognitive functions. Can you please explain what you mean by that?
So what happens, again, this is related to what I was describing earlier, physiologically. Well, changes also take place cognitively. We get a narrowing of the field of vision. And if you think from an adaptive standpoint, if our field of view is becoming narrowed, once we've identified a threat, the potential adaptation is so we can see the threat more clearly. So we're focused on that. You know, if you listen to eyewitness encounters of bank robberies or crime scenes, there's something known as weapon focus, and that's individuals will focus on a weapon to the detriment of processing other information in their environment. So another thing that happens is their ability to concentrate or divide their concentration becomes diminished. Memory processing is disrupted. There are things that are remembered, there are things that can't be remembered. Under a high degree of stress, memory is quite dynamic, and it can be unreliable. If you think about Daniel Schachter at Harvard University is one of the preeminent memory scholars, and he has a nice term describing memory. He describes memory as having fragile power, meaning that our memory for gist is incredible and quite impressive. Our memory for the gist of things is quite good. However, our memory for detail is very vulnerable to a variety of things like intrusions, interference, suggestibility, source memory errors. There are a number of ways that our memory for details becomes vulnerable under stress. That happens a lot.
Okay. Maybe not as a side note, but how a person is interviewed, could that influence memory?
Absolutely, and how a person is questioned. I mean, those of you in the legal realm are well versed in the notion of leading questions. You don't want to introduce information or suggest things to an individual. What you want to find out what they're able to generate on their own. And so, within the realm of interviewing post-event suspects or post-crime scene events, eyewitness credibility is notoriously sensitive to error. We don't always remember things that we think we saw or heard. We don't remember them well, and we're very poor judges of how accurate our memory is.
Okay. In paragraph 2.3, you took the time to identify research conducted on elite military personnel engaged in high-intensity training operations. Why did you mention that under opinion number 2?
Well, I wanted people to understand that even in high-functioning, highly selected individuals, one of the premier training programs for us is called SEER School. SEER is basically survival in captivity. They're put through a mock POW situation, and they're learned how to endure interrogations, harsh interrogations, and survive. And the motto is to return with honor. And one of the things that we prepare individuals for is a high-stress interrogation. And we wanted to see how accurate individuals' memories were. So after the high-stress interrogation, we asked all of the students in this survival course to identify, to see if they could recognize the face of their interrogator. And their memories were greatly impaired, no better than chance. And these are very smart, physically fit, very capable individuals. So memory is vulnerable.
Okay. And you went on, I believe, to compare what the elite military that go through that kind of training you compare that a little bit to what Officer Brelo experienced in this case.
That's correct, and I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that Officer Brelo is a Tier 1 Special Operations asset. I don't know, he might be. Even if he was, he's not impervious to these types of impairments. If he's not, it would suggest that he's even more vulnerable to stress-related impairments.
Okay. Can you indicate to the court how does stress impact higher order cognitive function, such as memory, as you do in paragraph 2.4?
Right, so if you think about the systems that the brain is running, higher order cognitive functions under stress are not one of them that's really needed. What's needed under a high degree of stress is survival. So the brain redirects all resources to neutralize the threat, and that is characterized by the fight or flight response. The fight or flight response, fight, fear, fight, flight, freeze, that response is designed to neutralize the threat, either by removing yourself or removing the threat. So higher order cognitive functions are impaired.
Okay. And you also have an opinion relative to Officer Brelo under paragraph 2.4. Where you indicate that kind of things.
So reading from my opinion, higher order cognitive functions of memory, judgment, and decision making are especially sensitive to stress. Uncontrollable stress, even when mild in intensity, if it's something that can't be controlled by the individual, causes dramatic change in the prefrontal cortex, the brain region that executes these functions. Officer Brelo's cognitive functioning, particularly memory, judgment, and decision making, were influenced by the duration and intensity of stressors encountered throughout the entire event.
You go on in paragraph 2.6, page 8 of 13, to explain how the brain works in response to a threat. And this concept that you've mentioned, fight or flight, is a significant part of that. Can you define what that is?
So fight or flight is really closely related to another concept, and that's the threat imminence continuum. We all have talked about terms like worry, anxiety, and fear, and those are most appropriately understood on a continuum. If you think about a threat being unidentifiable and far away, so it's ambiguous, it's free-floating, that's when we worry. We have worries about things that haven't happened yet. We're really not sure what's going to happen. There's some degree of ambiguity. Maybe they don't happen at all. Maybe we're not even really sure what we're worried about. We're just worried.
What are some examples of that?
So worried about, the future of, our career, or the future of what's going to happen to our family, or we worry about, geopolitical events. Those are low-level anxiety, free-floating worries, non-specific sometimes, but things that are distant to us. Then as the threat becomes more clear and more readily identifiable, we move into things like anxiety. Anxiety about testifying at a trial. Anxiety about appearing on TV. Anxiety about talking to your boss. Anxiety about an argument. So there is the threat has moved from distal to proximal. It's closer, it's more immediate, and it's more readily identifiable. It becomes a little more concrete. At the far end of that spectrum, the threat is identifiable, and it's close, and it's real, and it's imminent. And that's the fight or flight response in response to a close threat.
How is that important to understanding Officer Brelo's behavior during the shooting that occurred in this case?
It's important in this context, from my understanding, is that Officer Brelo was the closest, if not one of the closest individuals to the suspects in this case.
Okay. So, for example, if a car is coming directly at you, and you've received information regarding gunshots fired, guns pointed, is that sort of what you're speaking to?
Exactly. I think Officer Brelo even indicated that he felt and heard bullets going overhead and felt as if he was being shot at.
You go on to give an opinion in paragraph 2.6 relative to where Officer Brelo's final stance is supposed to be in this case. Can you identify that sentence and what you meant?
Important to understanding Officer Brelo's behaviors during the shooting is that during the fight or flight response, the brain inhibits. In other words, the brain reduces complex, demanding, energy-consuming processes and redirects metabolic resources to preparing the individual for survival and possible tissue damage. In this condition, the brain is signaling to the rest of the body self-preservation is paramount. Officer Brelo's responses, even being on the hood of the suspect car, are consistent with an overwhelming fight response aimed at eliminating the threat to achieve self-preservation.
You go on to paragraph 2.8, and I guess my question is, once the fight response is activated, how difficult is it to turn it off?
That's what we call inhibition of response, and it becomes more difficult once the system has been activated to neutralize a threat. It is hard to dial it back, and it takes time and energy and effort. Ultimately it is, but it's one of the hardest things to do. Probably the most crucial cognitive and fine motor skill that we teach our guys in close quarters combat situation are shoot, don't shoot decisions. Working with high-speed, high-functioning guys, when they go into a house and there is an unknown threat, difficult to identify, and they turn a corner and expose themselves, on average they've got about 250 milliseconds to orient, identify, and pull the trigger. 250 milliseconds is a quarter of a second. Very difficult to do for even the most well-trained individuals.
When we talk about the difficulty of turning off the fight response, and if there is difficulty in turning off the fight response, does that mean that there's a lack of discipline or choice, or what's going on?
No, there's not a lack of discipline or choice. It is, if you think about your own, some of the most intense emotions that you've ever had, how difficult it is to, walk yourself back from that. And it doesn't always happen in an instance. And that is often in, I'm talking about non-life-threatening examples. If you can extend that, if you can, to a situation where your life was just threatened and you thought you were going to die, difficult to walk back from.
Okay. Can you identify, can you please indicate to the court what your second opinion is, the extended version?
Opinion 2, as his proximity to and confrontation with threat increased, Officer Brelo's mental state was increasingly dominated by fear for his life and the lives of his partners. His reactions were compelled by a mindset intent on eliminating perceived threat. Whether his actions were consistent with police practices or Marine Corps infantry training is independent of the fact that his actions were consistently focused on identification and elimination of a reasonably perceived and imminent threats to his lives and the lives of those around him. At the time of the alleged offense, Officer Brelo's mental state was dominated by fear. His reactions were compelled by a mindset to eliminate the perceived threat to his life and his partners. The actions taken by Officer Brelo in the late evening hours of November 29, 2014 were intended to neutralize this threat.
Okay. On to opinion number 3. The central word is dissociation. You discussed that. Can you tell the court what is it dissociation means?
Dissociation means a disruption in the normally integrated functions of information processing. And dissociation can be both adaptive and maladaptive. So by adaptive, I mean under a high degree of stress. One of the common examples is, for example, take a rape victim. You'll often hear them recounting the crime as an outer-body experience. And they'll often say it was as if they were outside of their body looking down on the event. That's dissociation. That is arguably an adaptive function that the brain enters into under a high degree of stress.
Is there more than one type of dissociation?
There are different what we call indicators or different symptom types of dissociation. You can have derealization, which is things seeming as if they weren't really. Is this really happening? That's a type of dissociation. There's also depersonalization, and that's the example I just gave to you. And this is not me. This is not happening to me.
Okay. And how long can dissociation last?
It varies. Typically, it's transient, so it can last. During the stressful event, it can be lingering during the what we call peritraumatic time, post-event, and it can come and go over the next course of weeks or months.
Okay. I want to take you to paragraph 3.4. And in that paragraph, you indicate that based on your review of the evidence in this case and Officer Brelo's statement, did you come to learn certain feelings that he expressed?
It did, and these are based off of statements that he provided during the interview. So I watched both his interview video and I read his transcript. So the statements that he were making, such as, quote, "I've never been so afraid in my life. I thought my partner and I were going to be shot and killed." He believed he first fired 5 to 6 rounds, thought he had a jam, and reloaded from the magazine on his duty belt. As he exited the vehicle, he was expecting to get rammed by the suspect vehicle and said, "I'm terrified of being hit by the suspect's vehicle." Officer Brelo then loses track of his partner. He recalled firing 5 to 6 rounds into suspect's vehicle and said, "I feel like I'm being shot by suspects, and I see them keep moving. I look down at my magazine and see that I'm empty. I crouch behind my patrol car. I remember seeing officers firing." Officer Brelo further described, "I crouched with my feet on the trunk of the car. I was thinking, why are they still moving? Why haven't they stopped? Why are they still shooting at us? I was also afraid that the engine block was stopping our rounds." To avoid being crushed, Officer Brelo climbed up car 238 and then shot down into the suspect's car in an effort to reduce crossfire. He recalled his Marine Corps infantry training that taught him to gain higher ground and push through the target in a firefight. As he was firing into the car, he observed the suspect still moving and shooting and said, "I've never been so afraid in my life. And I couldn't understand why the suspects were still moving, shooting at us." He further stated, "Next thing I know, I'm next to the driver's side of the suspect vehicle. I have absolutely no idea, sir. No idea how, sir. I don't know if I went around the left or the right. I have no idea. I've been trying to rack my brain, but I don't remember how I got over there." Officer Brelo shot 49 rounds, but he said he felt as though he shot only 15.
Is this an example of dissociation?
This is exactly what I'm talking about.
I want to ask you about the concept that you mentioned in paragraph 3.6, page 12 of 13. What is a glucocorticoid?
Glucocorticoids are stress hormones. They're hormones that the body releases under high stress in order to help us survive a stressor. They're the body's natural painkillers.
Okay. In paragraph 3.6, you go on to make a statement concerning Officer Brelo's acknowledgement and later maybe not recalling. Can you indicate that, what you meant?
Yes, Officer Brelo is describing having difficulty remembering different aspects of the entire event. And so related to glucocorticoids, we know that in healthy young males, that high stress situations high levels of glucocorticoids can alter memory.
Okay. And in paragraph 3.7, excuse me, the last sentence, can you read that into the record?
The fact that on one occasion Officer Brelo acknowledged that he was on the hood of the suspect vehicle does not preclude him from having been in a dissociative state or having difficulties remembering on subsequent occasions.
Did you learn in this case that Officer Brelo acknowledged having been on the hood of a vehicle?
Yes.
Okay. And do you recall who those statements were made to, or?
I don't remember. I think those statements were made through the course of his interview. That's what I remember them being made. I don't remember exactly who he made those statements to after the event.
And you've indicated here that the fact that he may have acknowledged it on one occasion doesn't mean that he would not experience disassociation. Is that correct?
That's correct, and it also doesn't mean that he might not remember it later. I mean, we've actually done systematic research on combat veteran memories over time, both Vietnam veterans and veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. And we've asked them through, we use a standardized scale, the combat experiences scale, and we'll ask them questions. Then we'll reassess these same veterans a year later and 5 years later, and we've found that memory changes over time.
Does it mean that he was necessarily lying about what he may have previously acknowledged?
No, memory is highly dynamic. Conventional wisdom, especially in law enforcement, is that if an individual's story is changing in the retelling, that's an indicator of deception. In fact, what we know is the opposite is quite true. One of the efforts that I've been involved in within the U.S. intelligence community was a project with the Harvard Business School and their high-stakes negotiation program. We wanted to get at ways to get information from individuals more reliably. So we use things like something called a cognitive interview. I worked with Ed Geiselman at UCLA. He developed the cognitive interview. It's widely used through law enforcement intelligence community. And it's a way of getting the individual to unravel their recollection of the events through a series of steps. And those steps involve retelling of the event from a third-person perspective, retelling the event in reverse order, using all of their sensory information to try and reinstate what happened. When that's done, the individual will necessarily remember different aspects. And we consider that a good and reliable thing. In fact, one of the indicators that somebody is withholding information is that through the course of the cognitive interview, they don't remember anything new, or their story doesn't change. And that's usually an indicator of deception.
Okay. Dr. Johnson, can you please state opinion number 3 to the court?
It is reasonable that Officer Brelo perceived his...
Actually, hold on one moment. Did you say objection?
Yes, Your Honor. And my basis is he's going to read, like, I don't know, almost a page of his third opinion, Your Honor. I believe that the opinion speaks for itself. And I believe it's appropriate to read the whole. I mean, he can express it here, but to read it, I believe this is inappropriate.
Well, the way he can express it, a way one can express it is to read it. It's not of record because this report is not in evidence. I'm guessing if it's offered, it would probably be objected to. It can be awkward, clunky, but if the opinion itself is not objectionable for lack of qualification or other reason, it's a workmanlike way of getting it into evidence.
Thank you.
Thank you, but overall.
Go ahead, Doctor.
I'm happy to distill this, and that is to say that Officer Brelo experienced symptoms that are consistent with dissociation under a high degree of stress. His inability to recall aspects of the event are consistent with individuals who've experienced high magnitude, life-threatening stress.
Okay. Thank you for distilling that. As a result of your involvement in this case, did you receive another document that you reviewed from a Dr. James Knoll?
Yes,
Okay. And did you have a chance to read his opinion relative to your work in this case?
I did.
Okay. So let me ask you, in order for you to have arrived at the conclusions that you did in this case, was it necessary for you to have personal contact with Officer Brelo?
No, absolutely not.
And explain to the court why not. Why isn't that essential in making an evaluation in this case?
For a couple different reasons. One is that a lot of really good and even more objective information can be gleaned by watching someone else interview the individual.
Objection, Your Honor. This was not in his report.
Well, is Dr. Knoll here today?
He's in the courtroom watching.
We could have him have a conversation under oath. I mean, but it can be reasonably anticipated. So I understand your objection, but overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You explain, Doctor, why it's not necessary?
But before you go on,
My apologies.
for the prosecution, the written record should reflect that any questions to Johnson about Knoll's criticisms, in other words, Knoll's, I gather, supplemental report, are deemed as objected to, and those objections are overruled, and therefore it's not necessary to continue objecting.
Thank you, Your Honor.
However, if a question comes up that you have a separate objection to, by all means, then verbalize the objection. So you were saying?
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Johnson, why wasn't it necessary for you to have one-on-one physical interaction with Officer Brelo?
Yeah, I would also observe, by the way, that he could have phrased the question. Earlier in the direct, he said, I'm paraphrasing, but do you always have, is it necessary to have a direct interview to figure these things out? So these same questions could be phrased eliminating reference to Knoll's exact criticism. So, but I interrupted, well, not, you were done with your question. I interrupted before you had a chance to answer. So, why was it not necessary to actually speak to the defendant?
Because a lot of rich information and potentially more objective information can be gleaned from observing somebody else interview the individual. In this case, we had his interview, the transcripts of his interview, and then corroborating statements by other individuals. And what we're after in an assessment of somebody's mental state at the time of the offense is what they said, what they did, what they thought, and those can be gleaned outside of a direct interview. It's in my line of work, it's not uncommon.
Okay. And are there any formal tests that you believe that you should have administered relative to Officer Brelo's memory?
No. In particular, so I know Dr. Knowles brought up, assessing for malingering or, feigning of symptoms.
Well, there's a different objection then?
He's going specifically now into Dr. Knowles' report, Your Honor. I have no information. This is all new information he's going to be saying to me right now, Your Honor. So again, we have no notice of what he's going to be saying.
Yeah, but what was the date of Dr. Knoll's report?
Dr. Knowles' report, I believe, is March 15th.
Of this year?
Correct.
It can be reasonably anticipated that after his report, if he had seen Knowles, he would have some response. So I think this is not unfair. Let me put it that way. You were talking about whether you should or should not have performed formal tests on the defendant before coming to the conclusions you've offered here.
Yes, Your Honor. So formal testing would be indicated if there were some diagnosis that were in question and some specific disorder that was in question. He could have been administered the test of memory malingering, and whether he performed well on that test, indicating good effort and no memory malingering, or not, it wouldn't necessarily speak to whether he was malingering his memory at the time of his interview. So it is often done, standardized testing, but there were no specific diagnoses that were in question to assess whether he's malingering symptoms.
Should there have been any behavioral science research applied to this case that you can think of in any way that would have made a difference in your opinion?
No.
May I interrupt?
Yes, sir.
I want to be sure to what you're testifying to. You are not testifying that the defendant does not remember certain portions of this event, am I right?
That's correct. I'm testifying that his statement of not being able to remember is consistent with what we know about dissociation under stress.
Right. And you're also not testifying that that statement is an honest one or a credible, well, you're not suggesting that he is telling the truth. You're saying that his claim of lack of memory is, well, in essence, not uncommon or not unusual given the circumstances.
That's correct.
Pardon my interruption.
Thank you, Judge.
If you were given some proof, some definitive evidence that he was indeed faking the lack of memory, your opinions might change, I gather?
Absolutely.
Pardon my interruption.
Okay.
Are you worried that you're providing law enforcement with a script now to follow to justify any shooting?
Sorry, Judge, I didn't hear your question.
I inquired of him whether he's concerned that he might be giving future officers in similar positions a way to escape liability.
Thank you.
It's certainly a concern. I think that concern existed prior to my evaluation, and that is just in nature, if someone feels that their life is in danger, that's a plausible and reasonable explanation for why they behaved in a certain way. And I think that's going to be the case in any situation like this.
Pardon my interruption. And actually, as long as we're on an interruption, do you have a rough estimate?
Less than 5 minutes.
So what we'll do is we'll conclude the direct in 5 minutes or so, and then we'll take a break and you'll be cross-examined after that.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Sure.
Dr. Johnson, I'm going to refer you to page 12 of 14 of your report, paragraph 3.10. And you have that in front of you?
Yes.
You speak to Officer Brelo's inability to retrieve important details of the event. His inability may also have been a product of how he was interviewed. You recall that?
Yes.
Okay. Can you elaborate on that point?
So this is really the genesis of the cognitive interview, and that is when individuals are interviewed in a particular way, it influences what they remember as well as what they don't remember. One of the cognitive phenomena is something called retrieval-induced forgetting. The more you remember aspects of an event and the recurrent retelling, you will forget other aspects. And again, if I could just underscore, our memory is quite dynamic. It's vulnerable in terms of our recollection of detail. Under a high magnitude stress, it's even more vulnerable. And the key thing to keep in mind regarding memory and recollection of high stress events, individuals can both remember and forget at the same time. In fact, if you look at an extreme example, something such as a diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder, two of the key diagnostic criteria are, well, one of them is the inability to not be bothered to have intrusive memories. So that's having memories that you can't forget. So you're recurrently bothered by those memories. At the same time, another diagnostic criteria is being unable to forget, being unable to remember. So there's an inability to forget and there's a difficulty in remembering, and those both exist commonly within the diagnostic criteria, and that's with an individual who's diagnosed with a disorder, but that's there because the evidence base says this is how individuals recall information following a trauma.
Okay, so talk to us about the cognitive interview.
So the cognitive interview is designed to help give the individual cues and tools to get at information that they would normally get at by a casual conversation or repeating the same question over and over. It's also designed to help reduce post-event suggestibility and leading questions. So you have the individual come up with the information. So, for example, if I were to ask you about a highly emotional event in your life, let's take a positive example. Either the birth of your child or your wedding day, you're going to remember aspects of that. There are going to be aspects of that you don't remember. If we walk you through the cognitive interview and at first ask you to recall particular visual sights, little details that maybe you haven't thought about, smells, sounds, touch, we ask you to try and reinstate and remember different sensory information. You're going to recall new pieces of information. Then we'll ask you, well, what if a third person were standing there, what would they see? And you try and recall that scenario, that situation from the perspective of a third person. You get additional information that way. And then you ask them finally to recall it in a reverse order. So the sequence of events that they've just explained, you ask them to work backwards chronologically. And then finally you ask them to recall the event again. And evidence indicates that that process yields a more robust and rich set of information after an event.
Okay. I don't have any further questions, Your Honor. Thank you for your responses, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Max. Sir, you remain under oath and see you in about 15 minutes.
Yes.